Hi, welcome back to Discipleship Squared. Today I want to introduce a newer topic that we really haven't talked much about yet, and that's called transitional forms. What in the world is a transitional form, you say? Well, that's what today's talk's going to be about. If you remember from previous videos, what we do here at Discipleship Squared is we kind of use the model evidence approach. You can't prove creation or, say for sure that it happened because it was a historical event and nobody was there to observe it. Nobody was there to see it except God. So it's really hard to prove that we were created or that there was some kind of intelligent being, designing all the things that we have. But in the same token, the evolutionary approach is also hard to prove. And the reason why is because it takes too long, supposedly millions and maybe even billions of years. And you can't really necessarily repeat it in a laboratory, too. You might be able to do some simple adaptations, but to actually go from one kind of critter to a completely different type of critter just can't happen in just typical lifetime or several lifetimes. And so the idea here is we can still study it scientifically. What we do is we come up with models to explain what we do. And so our approach here at Discipleship Squared is that we take a look at the scientific data. We're investigating origins. There are two basic models: evolution, which is a naturalistic approach where everything happened just by chance, or the creation account. We were created by some type of designer. There's some type of intelligent design. And we have talked about this slide before. These are the predictions of each model. If you're an evolutionist, you believe everything happened by chance. Things came from simple to complex. There were many transitional forms during that process, and it's taken a long time. So we have an old Earth and an old universe. If you're a creationist or intelligent design type of person, you say that there's got to be design in nature, that there's some things that we can't explain, and we've talked quite a little bit about that in terms of our videos so far. Then we have like complex from the beginning. In other words, the creator created everything complex. It didn't go from simple to complex. We didn't evolve. We actually were complex from the beginning in terms of life on the earth and the planet. And then there are no transitional forms. If evolution didn't occur, then we wouldn't have these half in between transitional forms. And many creationists, intelligent design type of people believe in a young Earth and a universe. You don't have to be a young Earth universe person to believe in creation, but a lot of them are. So this idea of transitional forms, well, what do we mean by that? Well, if fishes turned into amphibians, it didn't happen according to evolution just by all of a sudden, you had a fish and it laid an egg and out popped an amphibian. Basically, what happens, supposedly, according to evolution, is that a fish got some kind of mutation that helped it survive a little better. And so because it survived better, it passed on its traits to its offspring. And because of natural selection, the most fittest survived. And then maybe another small change happened. And over a period of maybe hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of years, these small changes added up until you got to a new critter which didn't even resemble a fish anymore. It was an amphibian. Well, you have to have these in between types of things, something that's part fish and parts amphibian. That's what we mean by a transitional form. And notice, if you went from amphibians to reptiles, which according to evolutionists, that's what happened, you'd have to have some in between forms, some transitional forms. Same way between reptiles and birds. And of course, one of the common ones that lots of people think about is part monkey, part man. So the question is, are there really transitional forms? If evolution is true, then there ought to be a lot of indisputable transitional forms. Okay. So think about this. If a fish turned into amphibians, there ought to be some critters that are in between that have like, say, partial fins and then less than a more partial fin, more like a walking limb and eventually something they could walk on. And amphibians to reptiles, amphibians don't have claws, but reptiles do, and amphibians can get away from the or need to stay near the water, but reptiles don't. They can lay eggs, so they don't have to be in the water, like an amphibian egg, and so on. And so all of these little phylogeny trees here that you see between each major group, according to evolution, you have many of these transitional forms. And so the question is, do we have transitional forms? Well, what I'd like to do today is I'm not going to take a look at all of the transitional forms in this particular video. What I want to do is just discuss the development of flight in four groups of animals that actually did develop flight. If you think about it, there are four groups. There are birds, obviously. So you had to have some kind of critter, a reptile turned into a bird. So you have to have something that's in between reptiles and birds, and maybe several different in between forms. You have insects, so you should have some insects that don't have wings, and then maybe some partial wings, and then some full wings. And bats, of course, they can fly. And so you would have to develop that wing or hand type structure that enables it to fly. And in the fossil record, we find critters like pterodons and pterosaurs, which should also fly. So looking at flight ought to be a good way, if we just look at fossils and stuff, that ought to be a good way to show that there are lots of transitional forms. So let's talk about the reptile to bird one. One of the ones that first came out was a critter called Archaeopteryx. And they called this a transitional form. And the reason why is because it had claws on its wings and it also had teeth. Now, those are reptilian characteristics. And of course, a bird has feathers. Well, Archaeopteryx had both of these. It had claws on the ends of its wings. Now, notice it's on the end of its wings, that's front uh, limbs, not its feet. Okay, birds have claws on the ends of their feet, but this one had claws on the ends of its wings, and it also had teeth. So they called those were reptilian characteristics, but it also had birds or feathers, which suggested it was not suggested. It's a bird-like characteristic. So because it had both, Archaeopteryx was considered an in-between form. Now, this is a picture of what would have happened according to evolution. Evolution, this is the theropod. This would be a reptilian type of critter. And this is a bird over here, a chicken. And so obviously you have to develop some kind of in-between forms. And Archaeopteryx fit that because of wings, claws on the ends of its wings. And, this one had teeth. These guys had teeth. These guys didn't have teeth. So this fit is an Archaeopteryx fit as a transitional form. And in textbooks and stuff, it was always listed as one of the transitional forms. But then creationists and intelligent design people started to say, well, hey, wait a second. If you're going to call that a transitional form, then there's some birds today that have those same characteristics. There's the Turaco and the Hautsonite that believe they both are in South America. And when they are young, the juvenile forms have claws on the ends of its wings. And those claws aren't because it's a part reptile. It's those claws actually have a use. They help the chicks move around in the nest and be able to sit upright so that they can get food. And so, people who believed in design or people who believed in creation said, wait a second, if you're going to say that the Archaeopteryx is a transitional form, then if you found fossils of these, you'd say these are transitional forms too, but they're not. They're totally birds. And so after many, many years, Archaeopteryx has kind of fallen out of the transitional form category and into a bird category. Most evolutionists, especially those in the know today, would suggest that this is a true bird. It wasn't a transitional form. Now, there have been other ones as well that have been talked about. One of the common ones after Archaeopteryx fell from grace was this one called Archaeoraptor. It was discovered by a scientist in China, and there was a big article about it in National Geographic. I think it was like an 8 or 10 page article, and it had, the bones that were discovered and all that kind of stuff. And what's really interesting about this is that for about 5 years or so, this was really considered a missing link, the transitional form between birds and reptiles. But then what happened was some of the guys that worked with this scientist kind of leaked some information, and here come to find it out, this was a hoax. It was the guy had taken some bones and he'd filed them down. He had some bird bones and he had some reptile bones, and he filed them and treated with them artificial salts so they looked old. And he had presented it and as a transitional form. Now again, what's amazing to me about this is that for 5 or 6 years, lots of people looked at this evidence. They looked at the bones, they looked at the articles, and they just believed it. They said, no question, it was a transitional form, and yet here it was a hoax. I think this kind of displays the bias that science has right now, in that we're so sold on the evolutionary theory that if anything even remotely fits that, we accept it, even if the evidence really isn't as clear as what we think. And in this case, a closer look at an examination of the evidence exposed the hoax. So again, there is a transitional gap, it appears like, between reptiles and birds. There are no true, widely agreed upon transitional forms between reptiles and birds. Now, another way that flight developed was the pteranodon, okay? And notice the bones here. Now, this is the hand bones. Here's kind of like the thumb and the first three fingers, but notice this other finger here. Look how long it is. Now, evolutionists say that pteranodon came from a reptile character, or came from a reptile that would be normal reptile that would just be walking around normally on a normal hand. But somehow this one finger seemed to develop into a longer and longer and longer finger. Now, this would have had to happen over millions of years. This finger would get longer, and somehow that finger would also somehow make the pteranodon actually survive and have survival value. And we don't really know how we could have survival value by having a finger like this long, or a finger this long, or a finger this long. You need this whole finger here in order for the leathery skin to attach, in order for this to actually be able to fly. We don't see any transitional forms where you have longer and longer fingers. Same way here. This one's a pterosaur. And again, notice that long finger. We should be seeing in the fossil record, if this really happened according to evolutionary theory, we should get small changes over lots and lots of years where this finger becomes longer and longer and longer and longer. But we see no transitional forms like that at all. Not only that, but notice the tail and this long keel or this big wide, end of the tail. Again, those things, we should see intermediate forms between those, between ancient reptiles and these. But you know what? We don't find them. We don't find the evidence for these longer and longer fingers. We see reptiles with small hands, and then we see reptiles with these great big long things and nothing in between, which suggests that there aren't any transitional forms between them. So there's no transitional forms for the long fingers in the reptile wings. Another way that flight developed was in bats. So this is an oldest bat that we have. Okay, and here is one of the reptiles that supposedly turned into the bat. And notice you have these small hands in this particular reptile, but in the bat, you have these longer fingers and extending fingers out into the wings. Now, how did this happen? Well, according to evolution, this is how it happened. You had maybe some type of skin or flap or something like that that developed out there at first in an ancient reptile, and then it got bigger, and maybe they glided around for a while, and then this one got even bigger, and now maybe they could maybe start flapping this, and eventually you got the hand that looks like it does today, where they can actually flap this whole wing of skin. So this is what evolution predicts is we should find in the fossil record things like this. But in actuality, we don't find any transitional forms between an ancient reptile and a fossil bat. Here's the oldest bat that we know of. Now, according to evolutionary standards, it's 50 million years old. Now, not all creationists would believe in that particular age, but using the ages that evolutionists say, what they're saying is for 50 million years, this is what the bats looked like. Okay. And here's, if you take that thing out and you stretch it out over a bat today, it's exactly the same. There are no transitional forms to show how bats develop these long fingers and wings. You have the oldest bat, and the oldest bat had all these wings, and you have nothing before that to show how those wings developed. So there's no transitional forms leading to bat wings. Another way is to look at insects. Most insects had wings. When you find them, they're fully developed. Say, well, an insect, that's so, how does that even fossilize? Well, a lot of the fossils that we have of insects come from insects that get trapped in sap on trees. And that sap eventually covers them up and kills them, but preserves them. And then that sap eventually, or a lot of times, turns into amber. And that amber actually has the fossil inside of it. And we have a lot of fossils that are insect fossils that are in that. You can even get necklaces and stuff like this now that have insects right in them. Well, here it is. These are the insects. They have fully developed wings. We don't have insects with partially developed wings. So there's no transitions in supporting wing development. So the point is, you know, in a place where you ought to see a lot of transitional forms, the development of flight in four different groups of animals, you don't see it at all. You don't see any transitional forms. And so intelligent design people, creation type people, what they do is they say, hey, this suggests that there aren't any transitional forms, that evolution didn't happen like evolutionists say it did. And so, this is one of the things that I think is a really convincing evidence that the creation account is actually true. That things don't occur. These transitional forms aren't in the fossil record, and because they aren't, that suggests that evolution didn't occur, at least like evolutionists say it did, in small jumps over small changes over long periods of time.